All right, so we are moving on to lesson 4 now. Lesson 4, there actually aren't any new lesson notes, so we're going to get right into the examples. So for each labeled tick mark, and when I say labeled tick mark, I mean, whoops. When I say labeled tick mark, I mean these here. Okay. For each labeled tick mark on the horizontal axis, plot the value of y equals cosine x. Here, x is the measure of an angle in degrees. Use your notes from the previous lesson or technology to estimate the values of cosine x. Make sure your calculator is in degree mode. Now, normally I would have you draw the graph on the axis here, but because we're using technology, and because some of you are virtual, we're going to use technology. We're going to use Desmos. So each of these tick marks are indicative of x values. So we're going to look at x equals 0, 60, 120, 180, so on and so forth. And then the y value is going to be, in this case, we're going to look at the cosine of each of these angle values. All right, so I'm going to go to Desmos here. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to double check that my calculator is in degree mode. Remember, degree has to be highlighted, okay? And then I'm also going to change the window settings here. Again, if I click on I can do that by clicking on the wrench. I'm going to change the settings to exactly the same settings that are here. So notice the x values go from 0 to 360, and the y values go from -1 to +1. So notice what I did here. My x values 0 to 360, my y values -1 to +1, and you should do that in your graph as well. So my first point here is going to be at x equals 0. So to plot a point, I'm going to do parentheses, and my x value is going to be 0. My y value is going to be cosine of 0. And what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to change this, so I'm going to make it so that it goes a little bit past the 0 to 360, just to make it a little bit easier to see. So I'm going to make this like -1.5, +1.5. And you can see, notice, I have a point up here. Okay. The next tick mark is at 60. Looks like we go in 60-degree intervals. So the next is going to be 60, comma, cosine of 60. Okay, and there's your point there. Okay, the next point is going to be 120 cosine of 120. Okay, and then we have 180 cosine of 180. And we have 240 cosine of 240. And we have 300 cosine of 300. And then we come back to 360, comma, cosine of 360. There's our points here. Okay. So if you were drawing this on paper, you would plot these points and then simply connect the lines and you would get the graph here. If I wanted to actually connect the dots here, I would in a separate line, I would do cosine of x, and notice it creates that cosine curve there. Okay. So that's what we're going to do so number 1, it looks like this. Okay. For number 2, we're going to do the exact same thing that I just did here, except I'm going to change all the cosines to sines. So I'm going to do the same thing I just did in number 1, but all the cosines are now going to become sines. So that's literally all I'm going to do, is I'm going to change all the cosines to sines, and we're going to see how that changes things. Okay. And if you're doing this on your computer, you can do the same thing that I'm doing. Okay, you can literally just erase cosine and type in sine. Just putting in sine and cosine. And if I type in sine x, notice it connects the dots here. Let me zoom out just a tad so you can see all the points there. Okay, so notice it puts those points. So notice cosine and sine. So the red graph in this case is cosine. The blue graph is sine. Notice they're basically the same graph. One is just shifted over a little bit. Okay, so that's what the cosine is, and you can see this because it's the graph is a wave. That's how it gets its periodic function nature. That's why the values repeat themselves, because it's just a wave that is repeating itself over and over again. So we did the graph of cosine and we did the graph of sine. Okay, for number 1 and number 2. For number 3, okay, let's take a look at these questions here. For number 3, the variable t represents an angle measure in degrees for which values of t is sine of t greater than 0. So in other words, for which values of t is sine of t positive. So we're looking for sine to be positive. Now to figure that out, I can either look at the graph of sine here. I can look at the sine graph here, or I could go ahead and look at my notes from lesson. I could look at my notes from lesson 3, I believe. Okay. Yeah, these are our notes from lesson 3. This tells me where sine and all the others are positive. So sine is going to be positive in quadrant 2, but it's also positive in quadrant 1 because all 3. So quadrant 1 is 0 to 90. Quadrant 2 is 90 to 180. So in total, sine is positive between 0 and 180. Or I could look at the graph. Here is the graph of sine. You can see it's positive between 0 and 180. So sine is positive between 0 degrees and 180 degrees. So that's all I'm going to write. Number 2, for which values of t is cosine of t less than 0? So now I'm going to be looking for cosine to be negative. So again, I could look at the notes from lesson 3, or I could go to Desmos and I could look at the graph of cosine. So where is cosine negative? Okay, so it's going to be negative. If I'm just sticking from 0 to 360, it's going to be negative between here and here. So it's negative between 90 degrees and 270 degrees. So between 90 degrees and 270 degrees. Okay. For which values of t is cosine of t less than 0 and sine of t less than 0? So for which values is we're looking for cosine to be negative and sine to be negative. So we're looking for both of these to be true. So if I put both of those graphs in, where is the instance where both of these are negative? So cosine, which remember is the red graph, we know is negative between 90 and 270. So cosine is negative in this range here. Now at 90 degrees, cosine is still positive. Sine is still positive. So where are both the red and the blue graph both negative? They're both negative right around here, right? So cosine is going to be negative. So cosine and sine are both going to be negative between 180 and 270. And if I didn't do that, I could go back to my lesson notes. If I didn't, I could go back and look at my lesson notes from lesson 3, okay? And I'm looking for where is sine and cosine negative. Well, sine and cosine are both going to be negative. Well, in this case, it's going to be quadrant 3, because quadrant 3 is where tangent is positive. So if tangent is positive right here, that means sine and cosine are both negative. So in quadrant 3, which is between 180 and 270, is where sine and cosine are both positive. So I just did number 3 two different ways for you, essentially. All right, number 4. Are there any angles t for which sine t is equal to cosine of t? Are there any angles? Well, in other words, do the graphs of sine and cosine intersect? And I can clearly see here that they do. Okay, if I'm just looking between 0 and 360, I'm just erasing these points here. Notice they intersect here, and they intersect here, and they don't intersect anywhere else in that 0 to 360 range. Okay, so are there any angles t for which sine and cosine are equal to each other? And the answer is yes. And what angles? They're going to be at 45 degrees and 225 degrees. Okay, how do I know? Explain how you know. Well, how do we know? Because the sine and cosine graphs intersect at those points. So the sine and the cosine graphs intersect at those points.